Hello everyone and welcome to Module 2 in your Professional Diploma in Photography. I hope you're all excited about bringing your photography skills a step further, and well done on making it to Module number 2. We're going to up the skill level a little bit in these lessons so you can get even more out of your photography and build on all the new knowledge that you acquired in Module 1. So did you know that Robert Cornelius captured the very first portrait, a selfie, in 1839, not very long after the official invention in photography? And now, because exposures took so long back then, he was able to set up the camera, create his exposure and run into the frame and sit down, and then simply get up and place the lens cap back on. So the very first portrait coming very, very shortly after the invention of photography, and very relevant to what we're going to be covering in this very first lesson. So you are, of course, here with myself, William Eames. Great to see you all back here again on module number 2. We have a huge amount lined up for you, but the key to success is to show up to every single lesson. So you've now completed the basics. You've completed module number 1. We're into module 2. We've still got module 3, module 4 to come as well, and of course then you'll get your certification and your professional diploma in photography. As usual, throughout the lessons you can interact with Morpheus. Any questions that you may have for me, any questions you may have for Morpheus, simply type them in there, and please do rate the responses. Now, we do see all of these responses that you put in, all of these questions that you ask. So if there's ever anything that you're not sure about, please do let us know through Morpheus, and we try our best to get back to every single person. Now, what are we going to be having a look at throughout this course? Well, we've got 8 brand new lessons for you in module 2, and we're going to kick things off this lesson by having a look at how to take better portrait photographs. Then we'll move on to having a look at how to take better landscape photography, which is a lot trickier than you might realize. We'll have a look at the importance of color in our photographs, how we can use color to communicate emotions, to communicate and add atmosphere and mood within our photographs. We'll have a look at then at scene in black and white. So having mastered color, we can then remove that and add another element to our photography. A very popular lesson, we'll have a look at low light and nighttime photography, how you can capture really stunning images like the northern lights. We'll have a look at macro photography as well, a very technical area of photography. It's going to be a very enjoyable lesson. Food photography, a lesson I'm really looking forward to. So for all of you people who are into cooking, maybe posting up your photographs on social media, and that, we'll have a look at how you can get better photographs of food. And then we'll finish things off in this module by having a look at wildlife photography and how you can get out there and perhaps start making a career for yourself by capturing wildlife photographs. So without further ado, let's get into this lesson all about portrait photography. And the very first thing to say to you is that portrait photography is important. We are very diverse people. Every person out there is very complex and has a story to tell. And as photographers, we want to capture these stories. We can tell so much about a person through a portrait. And portraits can communicate so much to us. They can reveal a lot of information to us, or they can serve a purpose as well, a functional purpose, as we will see throughout these lessons. So if you're not already doing a little bit of portrait photography, perhaps you may be a little bit shy about taking photographs of people, I do encourage you as photographers to start with yourself, start taking pictures of yourself, and then gradually start taking pictures of the people around you as well, as it will really develop your skills as a photographer. So in this lesson, we're going to have a look at what a portrait should do, what it should achieve. We'll have a look at the different types of portraits that we can take, and then we'll have a look at some of the technical approaches that you can take then as well to improve the quality of your portrait photography. But we'll cover all of that throughout this lesson. So first off, a good portrait should achieve a number of things. A good portrait will, first of all, most of our experiences with portrait photography would be through advertising, would be through beauty advertising, fashion, lifestyle, so on. So portraits are used to promote products. Now, one of the things that's great about this type of photography is that it is actually an area where you can get very experimental, very conceptual. There is a lot of creative freedom when working with portrait photography. Usually, companies like Dior and indeed other kind of high fashion brands and that, they will allow a lot of room for photographers to develop ideas, to come up with concepts, and typically you'd be working with a huge team as well. It's a very, I suppose it has a glamorous appeal, but it is a very technically demanding area, a very high pressure area as well, but also an area that you can make a lot of money too. So, portrait photography used very much in the world of advertising and promotion. But of course, a good portrait will also reveal character, will show us insights into somebody, and show us, I suppose, a little bit of their personality. Very, very famous photograph here from Richard Avedon, arguably the best portrait photographer that's ever lived. And Avedon photographed, I mean, if you ever look at his portfolio, he pretty much photographed every single major celebrity throughout the 20th century. And he took this photograph of Marilyn Monroe when she was at the height of her fame. And it's, as you can see, it's kind of an image where she was caught unaware. She was caught either deep in thought, perhaps she was just daydreaming, but it shows us something a little bit different about her compared to I suppose the image that we would have had of her, from her films and so on. And obviously there's a lot of tragedy surrounding Marilyn Monroe. And there's a hint of that within this photograph. So a very iconic shot here, revealing another layer of depth to this fascinating character. Portraits can also be used to inform the viewer. They can be used as a documentary style to let us know about particular situations that are going on, and very important because we can relate to people. If we see somebody going through a crisis and this is captured on a photograph, we imagine ourselves in that position because we're human, because we can see and we can understand things like people's facial expressions. We can understand body language even if it's captured through a photograph. And this very iconic photograph from Dorothea Lange, the migrant mother, this is Frances Owens Thompson. This was captured in 1936 during the Great Depression in the USA, and that affected the entire world as well. And we can see the hardship, we can see the concern, we can see the stress in this photograph that just pretty much summarized everything that was happening around that time. Now, some of you may have been expecting this photograph to come up as soon as this lesson began. Perhaps, in contention with Dorothea Lange's photograph of the migrant mother for the most iconic photograph of the 20th century is, of course, The Afghan Girl by Steve McCurry. And Steve McCurry, very famous for photographing the world, for documenting, culture all around the world. And good portrait should do that as well. And I mean, especially if you're out there and you're traveling and you like to explore the world, document the people that inhabit it as well. Because one of the things that makes portrait photography so appealing is just how diverse we all are. And I have to say, no matter how many times that I see this photograph, it doesn't compare to actually seeing it in real life. I did see it in real life, and of course, Steve McCurry, revisited this girl years and years later and photographed her again. And you can see the two photographs side by side. They're often displayed side by side. But actually seeing it in real life, it is quite breathtaking. So if you ever get a chance to see it in real life, if there's ever a Steve McCurry exhibition near you, or if it's part of a group exhibition, I absolutely encourage you to go and see it. And finally then, of course, perhaps the most important thing about portrait photography is what it means to us, is our personal connection with it, documenting and capturing the people that are around us. Photography for me is like a currency that just becomes more valuable as time passes. When you take a photograph of somebody, and even if you get a photograph taken of yourself, while you may not think much of it at the time, you might be like, oh, that's a good photograph, it's a bad photograph, it's indifferent. You will definitely feel differently about it in the years to come. and you want to be sure that when you are taking those photographs that you're doing the best possible job that you can at the time. And so when you're looking back on these memories, that you felt that you really captured that loved one, that you really got what they were all about and what they meant to you. Now, of course, that's all guidelines, really. These are not rules that are set in stone, but do try to keep them in mind when you are capturing your portraits. So the next thing we're going to have a look at are the different types of portraits that you can take and the approach that you should take. Again, these are just tips that you should just keep in mind when you're practicing all these different styles of portraits. And the very first one to have a look at is probably the most difficult one, but the most rewarding one, which is candid style portraits. Candid photography is when we are capturing people at their most natural. And these are when we get the best portraits. When people are caught either unaware or, they just don't mind having the camera around. And for this reason, telephoto lenses are great because it allows you to keep your distance. It allows you to kind of capture people unawares, but the more comfortable your subject is with you, the closer you're going to be able to get, and you'll be able to certainly try out different types of lenses as well. Also, consider the type of camera that you're using too. I have found since changing to mirrorless cameras, due to some of the like the Olympus and Fuji in particular having the retro styling, people are a little bit more relaxed around these cameras and not as intimidating, as a hulking SLR like a Nikon D850 or Canon 5D Mark IV, with these giant lenses on them. Smaller kind of cameras certainly seem to put people at ease. And for that reason as well, your phone, don't forget about your phone. They are brilliant for doing portraits because everybody is so used to them. You should always have your camera with you. I mean, if you are a photographer, it should go without saying that you should be carrying a camera with you all the time. Again, having your phone with you all the time is having a camera with you all the time. But the more people associate you with having a camera with you, the more relaxed they're going to become, because they're going to assume that at any stage you may take a photograph. So it's a good idea to get yourself associated with being a photographer, and the way to do that is to always have your camera with you. And of course then, try to anticipate your subject's movements, try to anticipate their actions, and always be ready to take that snap. So, if you're out there and perhaps you're photographing, trying to get people on the street, have a look at the environment around you, have a look at how someone might interact with something that you're photographing, and try to anticipate it to capture those shots as they happen. Now, an area that is perhaps where most photographers will start taking pictures of people is, of course, with their own family, and this is arguably one of the most important areas where we want to be taking portraits that we are happy with. And when approaching taking photographs of family, think about how family units work together. Think about the relationships in family, who the parents are, how old the children are, what stage the children are, in their own development and that, and how you might incorporate and work all of that into a photograph. I mean, think outside the box when it comes to posing. It doesn't always have to be just going from the tallest people to the smallest people. When you start thinking about the relationships, it can influence where you place people in the shot. And speaking of, photographing children and different heights, when you are photographing children, get down to their level. This will create more of a connection because you are seeing the world from their perspective. Bring parents down to that level as well, like in this photograph. It just creates a more of a sense of fun, much more of a connection, much more of a relationship will come across within the shot. And do take a candid approach. Be casual, be relaxed. Don't be too, you do want to communicate with the family, whether it's your own family, whether it's a friend's or a stranger's family. But, let things happen as well. Let families have their interactions. And this will give you those great candid moments that we strive to capture. And get familiar with your camera's timer and that. So, that you can get into the photograph as well. One of the biggest problems that I have found when photographing families, my own family, is that I'm never in any of the photographs. And, my mother would be looking back at the photographs, and it frustrates her that I'm not in any of the shots. Now, technically I'm in the shots because I'm the person behind the camera, but you need to be in these photographs occasionally as well. So do get familiar with the camera's timer so you can be in the shot, and also perhaps a wireless remote, very good investment as well to be able to trigger the camera. One of the most appealing areas for portrait photographers is, of course, getting into fashion photography, as it is a very glamorous area. But fashion photography is a very technically demanding area. You really need to know your stuff when it comes to fashion photography. Very, very fast-paced industry. You need to have a lot of lighting knowledge. You need to know how to operate studio lights. You need to understand natural lighting and use accessories like reflectors to get the most out of it. So it is a technically demanding area, but you can be very creative, you can be very conceptual. I really like fashion photography because it's an area where I suppose fine art photographers would do a lot of fashion photography because they can be creative. They're given this room to come up with these ideas and to realize them and to see them through. And remember, no matter how much fun you're having taking these photographs, there is ultimately an aim here, and the aim is to sell a product, is to sell a lifestyle, is to sell an item of clothing. So you should never really forget that. You will need to do post-production and retouching. It's pretty much standard when it comes to this type of photography. You will be expected to know it as well by whoever it is you are working for, and you are going to be working as a team. You'll be working with makeup artists. You might be lucky enough to have a photographer's assistant, who'll be doing all the light readings, everything for you, setting up all the equipment and so on. But that is something that you should be learning yourself. So having good communication is very, very important. And of course, you're going to be working with a model too, so you need to be talking to your model. You need to be directing them and posing them, and they'll be used to taking direction, is what they would be used to. But always be courteous and always be polite as well. Now, a type of portrait photography that you may or may not be aware of is environmental portrait photography, as you can see here in this particular photograph. An environmental portrait is designed to show and reveal character or inform the viewer of the person in this shot through the area that you photograph them in. So, for example, in this picture, we can see the woodworker in his studio. You can get a sense of this person by the casual nature of the photograph, but by everything that's around them as well, by this workshop, by the little items that are in the photograph. So an environmental photograph should use props, it should use background to reveal the person, to reveal the character and inform us about this person that you're photographing. Sometimes you're going to need to be using accessories like external lights and flashes if you're in much darker environments, and typically indoor photography, unless there's a lot of natural light coming in, you are going to struggle a little bit. So most likely you will need to use a flash, something we are going to be having a look at in later lessons. And you want to capture your subject at work. I think the best way to get the most out of somebody is to talk to them about what they do, ask them about what they do, ask them questions about things like the daily challenges they face, what's the most rewarding part of the job. This is when you're going to get the best photographs, and if you show an interest, they're going to be interested in you as well, and you'll build up a communication and you'll really get some great photographs, but you'll also get some great ideas. I find that when I'm talking to my subject and they tell me something about the industry, they tell me something about what they do that I didn't know before, I can quickly then come up with an idea and incorporate that into the photograph. Kind of along the same lines, but a little bit more, I suppose, with a corporate kind of edge to it, are headshots. Okay, these are a type of photograph that I take very, very frequently here. So a headshot is generally it's a professional photograph. So you do need a professional approach. Typically, you're going to be photographing, heads of companies that are going to be used on say their websites or business cards and so on. Usually, a flat, soft lighting works best. We don't want to do anything too out there. there's going to be an expectation that really what you want is just to have a professional looking portrait. So very straightforward, even lighting approach I find works very, very well. Black and white is a very good option in this particular case, especially when you've got this nice kind of flat, even lighting. You can really produce some nice black and white photographs for your client, and Head and Shoulders is typically the preferred option, but sometimes you'll do full length or 3/4 length portraits too. Keep your backgrounds nice and neutral. I would typically go with white or grey backgrounds. Black backgrounds are a little bit too heavy. They're a little bit too dramatic for a headshot. They're okay for theatrical headshots, actually. Black and white, or a black background is a great one for kind of a theatrical headshot, because actors would typically be under dramatic lighting anyway when they're on stage, so there's that association. But for anything else, for any kind of corporate headshots, you want to have kind of nice plain backgrounds. So really the key here is to keep things nice and simple and straightforward. You just want to produce a very nice headshot, nice and clean. That's the word I'm looking for. Nice and clean photo. A hugely popular area, and really a great area if you're trying to get into making a little bit of money, a career for yourself in photography, is with newborn photography. That's really exploded, I suppose, in the last 20 years, is newborn photography. It was always something that was out there, but it really seems to have taken off a lot more as people have gotten a lot more creative what they can do with newborn photography. So when you're approaching newborn photography, and I mean, you could be photographing babies that are 2 weeks old, so it can be quite a tricky area. But shoots should be fun and friendly and playful. They should be relaxed, and they should be casual. It can be very, very tricky because obviously you can't tell a baby what to do, but you should have lots and lots of props, lots and lots of nice soft things for them. You don't really want to use flash in this particular situation. It could upset the babies, but I've found as well it can also upset parents too. They can be a little bit worried about a flash popping off in the baby's face repeatedly. So continuous lights, nice soft lighting certainly works a lot better. Also, traveling to clients' homes is a really, really great thing that you can offer them. So if you have a portable studio kit, being able to photograph a baby in its own home, in the parent's own environment, it'll put them certainly at ease. They'll feel a lot happier about it, and you can simply set up a studio very, very easily, in their own space. And again, this is something we're going to have a look at in a later lesson, in our studio photography lesson. You really need to be patient here. As I said, you can't communicate with a baby, so you really have to take your time here. You have to be very, very delicate, and do not get frustrated, as it will show in the photographs. So do allow yourself plenty of time to get the shot. Allow a little bit of time if the baby gets upset, that the parents can calm them down. Maybe they need a feed and so on. A good time to photograph them actually is just after they have been fed, especially for newborns, because they'll be tired, they'll be asleep, and you can kind of get these nice shots then when they are asleep. As you can see, this baby is a little bit older, so you get that little bit more of a connection, a little bit more of an interaction. You really want to use a lot of props, as I've mentioned as well, to fill the photograph. You don't have to use props in every single shot, but they're just a really good way if you're struggling a little bit, just to give yourself something that you can bring into the shot, another element that if the baby is old enough that you can interact with, or something just to help, I suppose, fill the space a little bit more. So that's just some of the types of portraits that we can take now. Obviously there's a few that I've left out. We haven't touched on weddings, we haven't touched on portraits of pets, which we will be having a look at. We'll be talking about wildlife photography in a future lesson. We'll be having a look at pets at that stage. And we do have a course in wedding photography if you want to get into that area, that you should also have a look at. But in the interests of time, we'll move on, and let's have a look at some of the different techniques that we can use for portraits, how we can improve our portraiture through our cameras by understanding more of what's available to us. And the first thing that I would say when it comes to photographing portraits, you can obviously use whatever mode you are most comfortable with. You may be photographing on fully manual at this stage, but I find that I would stick with using aperture priority when it comes to photographing a portrait, because I'm not going to be too concerned about things like shutter speed. I'll still be paying attention to shutter speed, but I'm more primarily concerned with making sure that they get a nice depth of field to focus the attention on the subject. So we spoke about aperture priority before. Just to give you a few tips about using aperture priority. So remember, aperture priority will allow us just to control the aperture in the camera. So the camera will handle every other setting to make sure that we get the correct exposure. So we can easily change the depth of field within this mode. Wider apertures are preferred for portraits. Now, it doesn't mean you're always going to use a wider aperture. Like, for example, with the environmental portrait we had a look at earlier on, that was certainly using a deeper depth of field to make sure that everything was in focus. But if you're getting the subject closer to the camera, a shallower depth of field is typically preferred. Now, I did mention shutter speed, so you do still want to pay attention to it. So when you're using aperture priority, it will still display your shutter speed. You want to make sure that you're trying to keep above 125th of a second if possible. Some photographers will say even faster. The reason for this is that your subject is going to blink, your subject is going to move, there's going to be these minute movements that happen, and you want to be sure that you minimize them as much as possible, so a faster shutter speed is preferred. Now, if you're using a wide aperture, it should help you to keep fast shutter speeds, but don't forget your ISO as well in case you are struggling a little bit. Remember, you can easily change the exposure too if you're finding things are a little bit over or underexposed. Use your exposure compensation to adjust as necessary. So it's a very, very fast way of working using aperture priority, and you should start with lower ISOs. Try to reduce that noise as much as possible, and that should be a rule for pretty much every type of photograph that you take. You want to start low and gradually increase if needs be, depending on the lighting conditions. And always remember as well, your aperture is going to be restricted by the lens that you are using. So if you are trying to get that little bit more of a depth of field effect, get closer. Now, this is something we're going to cover a lot throughout the course. We're going to have a look at aperture and depth of field much more in depth, pardon the pun, because it is actually a very complex area in photography. But as a tip, say for example you're photographing somebody, you're using a phone, you want to try and get a little bit more of a depth of field effect, get closer, as close as you can, while still maintaining the composition that you want. So, with our aperture priority in mind, now again, if you prefer to work fully manually, you can absolutely work that way, whatever mode works best for you. But I'm just going from my own experience. But with aperture priority in mind, what lens should you be using for portraiture? Okay, what's the best lens to use for portraits? You can use any lens to photograph somebody. And you can get very creative portraits by changing the type of lens that you use. But there is a particular range. If you're doing this professionally and you want to be consistent, you should be using general range of lenses, okay? So when we say general, I'm going to be talking in and around the 35 to 135 mil range. So that's quite a broad range. Some photographers would even say 35 is too wide or 135 is too close, but you'll see in a moment that range is ideal, because the other thing that you need to factor in is the fact that you can move backwards and forwards as well if you need to, and that is going to be a consideration. Do consider your sensor size as well. So when I'm talking about 35 to 135 mil, I would be using the standard 35 millimeter sensor. But if you're using a smaller sensor size, an APS-C sensor size, or micro four thirds as well, you'll need to make sure that you're using the equivalent range. Like for example, an APS-C size sensor, you're going to be starting from 18 millimeters. Maybe that's even just a little bit wide, going up to, again, probably around 100 millimeters. as I mentioned there before, distance plays a big role. And again, we'll see a visual example of this. If you are using a wide lens and you are very close to your subject, you're going to get a lot of distortion. So you will need to take a few steps back to reduce that distortion. If you are using a very zoomed in lens, like a telephoto lens, it tends to make everything very flat, as we're going to see in a moment as well. So again, you want to perhaps just pull back a little bit to reduce that effect. And we mentioned it earlier on, talking about candid photography. Higher focal lengths, focal lengths from like 70 millimeters upwards. They are great for candid photography in particular, and you'll hear a lot of photographers say 85 millimeters is a great range. It gives you really nice perspective, generally keeps everything in nice proportion, just gives you that enough distance to get those candid moments as well. And as I said, any lens can be used to capture a portrait when used correctly. So if you find yourself in a situation where you need to take a portrait and you feel that you haven't got the correct lens for that situation, it doesn't mean that you cannot get that portrait. There is always going to be a way to get it. So as I mentioned, for example, if you happen to only have a telephoto lens on you and you need to capture somebody, just take a few steps back. You just have to find that right distance and that right angle, and you will get the shot. And as I mentioned as well, if you're using a wide lens, try to center your subject and use a longer distance to reduce distortion. If you get too close to them, you're going to get this egg shape. You're going to get this, it's almost like it makes the person look like they have a really narrow face and a really big nose. And let's just show you. So this is from a photographer called Dan Wojtek, who he tested out all these different focal lengths to show the distortion that they have. Now he used the same distance for each of them. Okay, so each of these lenses is using the same distance, and you can see the effect that it has on the face. So when you go wide, you get this very egg kind of shaped face, but when you go with the telephoto, you're going to end up with a very flat type of face as well. So I'll just show you the images from that instead of the GIF, just so you get a better look at it. And if you see, like, for example, the 20 millimeter here, we've got a much more oval shaped face compared to the 200 millimeter, where everything seems to be almost completely flat. So you can see the ideal range. Even with the 35 millimeter, it's still kind of giving that egg-shaped face, but it's not as bad. But going up from 50 to 70 to the 105 millimeter, we're getting a bit more consistent there. You can see that it's a far more consistent portrait that's coming out at those focal lengths. Now, just a couple of other tips to up your portrait game. One of the areas that I find a lot of students struggle with is composition when it comes to portraits. So sometimes you don't always want to just have your subject in the middle. Sometimes you want to isolate them, you want to have them off to the side, you want to keep your depth of field. So making sure your subject is in focus might seem quite straightforward, but it can be a little bit trickier when we're trying to isolate our subject. So the first step that you should take is, generally when you're photographing in portrait photography, is you want to be using your single shot, your single AF mode. Now, some cameras and phones will have touch screens to select focus, which makes this very, very straightforward. You simply touch on your subject, and a lot of cameras with touch screens, you'll actually be able to touch on the subject and take the picture that way as well, similarly with phones. But you can use this technique that I'm about to show you, using touch screens as well. So select your single autofocus mode. You point your camera at the subject, point the center of the lens at your subject. You lightly press the shutter button or the exposure button to activate focus. You should hear the beep and you should see the focus points either light up in red or light up in green. And this means the focus has been achieved. Okay, so we want to recompose the shot then. So the next step is, without removing our finger, so we're still lightly pressing the exposure button, we recompose the photograph back to the way that we desire, and then we fully depress the button to take the shot. And this will work the exact same way if you're using a phone, you're using a touchscreen on the phone. You touch on the subject, but if you keep your finger placed on it, it should keep the focus on it, and then you can recompose and take the shot. So that will really, really help. That's technique that I learned very early on, and I've used it ever since. And you can become very, very quick when you get used to using it. Now, we're going to up that by adding in a new technique, one that will absolutely change your life if you can learn how to use it correctly. And that is a technique you may have heard before called back button focusing. Back button focusing, simply put, it's a way of putting the focus on a button on the back of the camera instead of having it on the exposure button. So when we take a photograph, typically we have to lightly press the button to focus it, then we have to fully press the button to take the shot. What back button focusing allows us to do is it removes the focusing from the exposure button, and it puts it onto a button on the back of the camera. So what that means is that when you take a photograph, that you're not using the exposure button to focus, you're only using the exposure button to capture the photograph, but you're using that button on the back of the camera to focus. So you're going to be basically simultaneously using your thumb to set the focus, and using your index finger to take the shot. Now, why would you do that? Well, it speeds things up incredibly. So if you're trying to take a photograph quickly, it's very frustrating when you press the exposure button and the camera has to quickly focus before it takes the shot. Those split seconds make a difference. By putting the focus on a back button instead, it means that you can be either presetting the focus, so you can actually preset the focus by simply holding the back button in while you're focused on your subject, and you can be shooting away the exposure button without that delay that it needs to focus. Now, setting back button focusing, unfortunately, it's not that straightforward. It is different for every camera. And on some cameras, it's not even available at all. So you will definitely need to refer to your manual or have a look online. But for those cameras that do have it, it is a custom setting. Setting back button focus is found in the menu of your camera. Again, have a look online. There is definitely loads of places you can find online to show you how to do this. YouTube videos as well. And it's typically set to the AF on button. So you can see here on the Canon and the Nikon, I have it highlighted there, the AF on button. If that's not available to you, the auto exposure lock button will replace that. Now, we'll talk about auto exposure lock in a future lesson, but you can use that button instead as your back button focus. And when set, you need to take time to practice, because you most likely are going to have muscle memory of using your index finger to lightly press the shutter button to focus, and then pressing it to take the exposure. It takes a bit of time, but trust me, you'll learn it quite quickly, because you'll get frustrated at the fact that you're not getting the focus. So it does take a little bit of time to forget that muscle memory, but it absolutely will speed up not just portrait photography, but any other type of photography that you do. Now, just to kind of round things up for this lesson, just a couple of less technical stuff, but just other things to be aware of when it comes to portraits. So one of those is where to crop. Okay, so as a rule of thumb, when we're photographing people, where to crop is that you do want to crop above any joints. Okay, you don't want to crop through joints. You want to try many poses. So just have a look on Pinterest. Unfortunately, you can't really go into all the different types of poses that are out there because it's infinite. But have a look on Pinterest. Pinterest is actually great for finding, pose sheets, so you can come up with some ideas. Remember the rule of thirds when you're composing as well. And when it comes to photographing people, central compositions work very, very well too. And when you're photographing, people make a decision. Do you want to fill the frame or do you want to leave room around the subject? Okay, either approach will work. But if you're taking somebody's portrait, you want to either make a decision to have the entire frame full up with them, or maybe you want to leave some room. Maybe you want to leave a little bit of room behind them to show off that depth of field or a little bit more of the environment. But the main thing to take from this is don't ever crop through knees, elbows, necks. I saw somebody say online, basically, if it bends, don't crop through it. Okay, so don't crop through knees, don't crop through elbows, don't crop too low on the face either. You don't want to be cropping just above the eye. You want to be cropping a little bit above the forehead if you have to crop the head. But that is the main thing to remember. Do not crop through knees, elbows, necks, and you should see a big improvement in the quality of your portrait. So let's just have a look at that. So I mean, if we take a portrait here, we have our typical head and shoulders shot. You can see here that we have the shoulders in. We've cropped well above the elbows. Or we can pull out a little bit. We can take things a little bit back and we can do an upper body. And we can see we have cropped below the elbows. You can pull back a little bit further and you can go just above the knees. So this is a 3/4 length portrait here. So we're still just above the knees here. Or you can go just below the knees as well. Pull back a little bit more, or you can go full length. But what we saw with each of those examples was that the composition felt correct, it felt natural, it looked right because we were not cropping through any joints. Now, so just to round off this lesson, so one of the things that I get asked about all the time, it's nearly one of the first questions that I get asked when people start photographing, is all about bokeh. And at the start, a lot of students will get bokeh confused with depth of field. But what is bokeh? What is it? So this curious cat, he's wondering what is bokeh. And basically, bokeh is the effect of the soft, out of focus light in the background that you get when photographing using a very fast lens. And when I say a fast lens, I mean a lens with a very wide aperture. So if we highlight it here, we can see it very, very clearly. Bokeh is those soft, round lights that we see here in the background. That's like an example of good bokeh. So the shape of the out of focus light, that soft blurriness, is known as bokeh. Now, so how can you get bokeh in your portraits? Okay, well, there's a number of steps that you can use to achieve this. The first thing is, you really, to get the most out of it, you need to have a prime or a fixed lens for best results. There is different shapes of bokeh, there's different types of bokeh, but a prime or fixed lens generally will give you the best results, and you need to use as wide an aperture as possible. So the wider the aperture, the better the effect is going to be. Now, you can close focus on the subject because that will also increase your depth of field effect. So if you're using, say, your 18 to 55mm lens, you can get great bokeh with that lens, and I've seen it being done if you can use it correctly. And that is basically opening that aperture as wide as possible, okay, getting closer to your subject, and you should get that nice bokeh effect. Now, another way to achieve it is to make sure that the subject that you're photographing is far away from the background that you want. So you're not really going to get that bokeh effect if you've got something, the light's very, very close to your subject. They need to be a little bit of a distance away because it'll increase that depth of field effect again. So you're close to your subject and the background is far away from your subject, and you should get that nice depth of field, which will give you that bokeh. And different lenses will produce different bokeh shapes. So if you're not getting a nice round shape, it's most likely due to the lens that you are using. So for example, if you are using, say, a zoom lens, these will typically produce a different type of bokeh effect from a prime or fixed lens. and try different light sources. The easiest way to get a bokeh effect for most people is that they will photograph at night. They'll use a very wide aperture and they'll use something like fairy lights. But there is other ways. Think about the light coming through trees. Think about candles in the background. They produce really nice effects. So there is no great trick to it. It really is, I suppose, ultimately it comes down to the type of lens that you are using, but closer to your subject, wide aperture and a bit of distance between your subject and the background, and you should begin to get some nice bokeh. Now, so we did cover an awful lot within this lesson, but there's still a huge amount that we have yet to cover. So for example, we really didn't talk about how to light your subject, but we will be having a look at that in depth in our lesson all about studio photography, which is also more about lighting. We'll be looking at how to photograph your pets as well, how to photograph them too in our wildlife lesson. So a lot of the areas that we didn't get a chance to cover in this lesson, they will be coming up in future lessons. The main thing to take away from this is that when it comes to portrait photography, it really is all about your approach. It's less about the technical stuff. It is much more about how you communicate with your subject and making sure you're putting them at ease and being confident in yourself to be able to talk and communicate and approach a subject. I think that's the biggest challenge when it comes to portrait photography, is overcoming your own shyness to be able to point the camera at somebody else. Now, so that is the end of the lesson. So coming up in the next lesson, we are going to be looking at landscape photography. So what I was saying, portrait photography is a little bit less about the technical stuff and more about your ability to interact and communicate. Landscape photography is almost the opposite. Landscape photography is actually very technical, as we will see. So we're going to have a look first of all at preparation and gear, making sure that you've got yourself set up correctly before going out and photographing landscapes. We're going to have a look at some landscape techniques, so what lenses you should be using, what are the best settings to be using, and then we're going to have a look at a little bit more of a complex area, which is how to get sharper landscapes. So the main objective when we're photographing landscapes is to try and get everything as sharp as possible, at least in most cases. So we're going to look at depth of field again, but we're going to look at really some very, I suppose, complex scenarios when it comes to depth of field that if you can master will make sure that your landscapes are tack sharp every single time. Now, remember to access your dashboard, visit shawacademy.com/login. In the dashboard, you can have a look back at the recordings, you can do your weekly assignments, you'll find all the notes and slides to the lessons there as well, and lots of bonus content too.